All right, welcome to the Explainer. So in Islam, everyone agrees the Quran is divine revelation. That's the foundation. But what about the Sunnah? The example set by the Prophet Muhammad.
The big question we're tackling today is, was it always seen as a second divine text? Right up there on the same level as the Quran?
Well, the source we're digging into today argues something pretty bold. It says that the idea of the Sunnah being a second, co-equal divine revelation, well, that wasn't how things started. It was actually a major theological shift that happened way later. So, yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so first things first. Let's really unpack this claim and make sure we're all on the same page with the key terms.
So what is the Sunnah? Basically, it's the Prophet's example. His teachings, his actions, the whole model for how to live a Muslim life. But the real question for us, the one at the heart of this explainer, is how is that model actually viewed right at the very beginning?
All right, so how does the author build this case? Well, they take us right back to the very first Muslim community. The idea is to see how they treated the Prophet's words and actions as it was all happening.
And the first piece of evidence the source brings up is kind of shocking, actually. It's a really firm early prohibition against writing down anything from the Prophet, except for the Quran. And the logic here is pretty straightforward, right? If the Sunnah was also considered divine revelation, why on earth wouldn't they preserve it with the exact same care?
So right away, this sets up a huge distinction in how the two were handled. According to this source, the Quran was seen as this protected, divine scripture. But the Sunnah, it was treated more like lived wisdom. Practical, on-the-ground guidance from the Prophet for specific situations, not another rigid, sacred book.
And this leads us to something the author calls a strange silence. It's this really fascinating paradox when you look at what was preserved from the Prophet's life and what wasn't.
I mean, the early community recorded and passed down an insane amount of personal detail. We're talking about things like the exact number of white hairs in the Prophet's beard or the step-by-step sequence of his ablutions. Just incredibly specific, personal stuff.
But here's the kicker. For all that incredible detail, the source points out a massive gap. Not a single complete Friday sermon has been passed down. And think about it, that was the Prophet's most regular public speech to the whole community. And we don't have a single complete one?
The author's argument here is that this silence can't be an accident. It has to mean something. It suggests that the community was focused on preserving specific ethical and legal examples, things they found important, not on trying to create a second holy book from scratch.
Okay, so from there, the argument shifts gears and looks at the Quran itself. What does the book actually say about its own purpose and its own completeness? Well, for one thing, the source highlights that there are over 300 verses in the Quran that start with the direct divine command, say. The implication's pretty clear. If God wanted something to be preserved as scripture, he just had the Prophet say it, and it went directly into the Quran.
And this idea is backed up by verses like this one, right from the Quran. The source uses this to make the point that the scripture literally describes itself as an explanation of all things. This suggests it was meant to be the one, self-sufficient, primary revelation. So if that was the original understanding, then obviously something changed down the line. And the source argues this wasn't just some slow, gradual evolution. It was a very specific, identifiable theological shift that happened later in Islamic history. This timeline kind of breaks it down. According to the source, you start in the Prophet's era, where the Sunnah is just lived wisdom. Then, in the next generations, people start compiling reports to hang on to those key examples. But the big change, the real turning point, happens in what's called the post-Shafi'i era. This was a time of intense legal debate and formalization, named for the famous scholar Imam al-Shāfiʿī. And it was then, we're talking centuries after the Prophet, that the Sunnah was formally elevated to the status of a second revelation.
Now, it's really important to be clear about what the author is and isn't saying here. This isn't an argument to throw out the Sunnah. Not at all. It's a challenge to what's being called its sacralization.
And the author is very direct about this. They're not questioning the utility or the wisdom of the Sunnah. The challenge is specifically aimed at what they call theological inflation, this idea of puffing it up to the same level as the Qur'an.
So, why does any of this matter? What's the big deal? Well, the source argues that this shift comes with some pretty big risks. For one, it can push the Quran out of its central spot. It can also lead to reports that were specific to a certain time and place being turned into timeless, universal laws. And it can give a lot of power to a clerical class because their interpretations suddenly get treated with the weight of revelation itself. And that really leaves us with the core tension of this whole argument. It's a question about where you draw the line between deep respect and divine revelation.
How does a tradition preserve and honor its prophet's incredible wisdom without elevating that wisdom to the level of a second, co-equal scripture? That question, really, is at the very heart of this entire discussion.